couple of years ago, your host for your address to the Washington Institute of Foreign Affairs annual dinner, the annual dinner we just had last evening. And now we thank you for being the opening speaker and scene setter for our conference this morning on networks of influence, Iran. If you'll allow me, I'd like to say just a few words of preface before we begin the conference and properly introduce you. You can't, I suppose, watch me, but everyone else is watching you on the screen. Good morning to all of you, and thank you for attending the conference this morning. It's a pleasure to see so many friends gathered for a topic that I suspect is actually on everyone's mind. If it's not front of mind, it's got to be back of mind. Before I say a little bit about the background to the conference, let me say that projects like this don't spring, full-blown from the forehead of Zeus or completely, they're not the product of any single genius. They are, in fact, a joint production. And to give you a glimpse behind the curtain of how this joint production works, it goes like this. Ambassador Chorva, our president, and I typically get together, usually this comes up over lunch or something like that, where one of us says, we need a topic for our next conference. And then we kick around ideas and come up with a topic, and then we consult with the staff, Joyce and Grace, to sift through this, and that nets a topic, in this case, networks of influence, Iran. So we come up with a topic and make a few suggestions of places to start to recruit speakers, and then Joyce and Grace do all the work. And so I think it's important as we go through this day to think about the work that goes into putting this program together, to finding the whole card of speakers, those who turn us down, those who aren't available, those who luckily are available, like Ambassador Crocker, who's willing to do this from long distance, well, all the work that goes into putting this together. A couple of us make suggestions gratuitously, a couple other people put in all the legwork that makes it happen. By way of preface, think about it for a moment. An exiled oppositionist local person in a European capital or a countryside villa turns up dead. A dual national American visiting family back in Iran in some village or whatever ends up arrested and imprisoned. Missiles slam into a Saudi oil refinery. Houthi rebels in Yemen drive the legitimate government, the recognized government, out of the capital, and before you know it, start interdicting shipping in one of the world's most critical sea lanes. Boats from Iran stop and seize a freighter on the high seas in the Straits of Hormuz. Hezbollah launches rockets at Israel from southern Lebanon. Or October 7th happens, leading to the conflagration that's ongoing in the Middle East. Iran doesn't necessarily cause the problems of the Middle East, speaking as a complete non-Middle Eastern expert. But it's pretty obvious that Iran makes everything worse, and that it's a very intractable problem. Yesterday at lunch with Ambassador David Hale, our former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, a question came up about, well, why haven't we done something about Iran? His answer was very interesting. If I could accurately compress it into a nutshell, it was, well, It's a very big problem. It's been with us for decades. We've tried just about everything that there is in the manual of statecraft to address it, and nothing has worked. So we don't talk about it very much. Well, today we'll have a chance to talk about it pretty much with some leading experts, and leading off with one of the foremost experts of all, Ryan Crocker. As to extend this just 1 second further, I hope, before I read you some notes about Ambassador Crocker's overwhelmingly impressive credentials, I'll share a personal vignette from my earlier years in Washington. In the time that Vicki and I were a one-car family and had a bargain, driving to work together, I drove the car, Vicki read me the Washington Post. This particular morning, we were crossing the George Washington Bridge, and she was reading about the latest outrage from the Middle East, whether it was massacres of Lebanese, one Lebanese group by another Lebanese group, or some terrorist attack in or on Israel, or whatever. It was another scene of bloodshed and carnage. And as she read this article to me, she paused and said, "I'm so glad you never worked on that part of the world." I didn't. But Ryan Crocker did, and has for much of his distinguished career. In addition to being dean and executive professor at the George Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, he is also the distinguished chair in diplomacy and security at the Rand Corporation. He's formerly been James Schlesinger Distinguished Visiting Professor at UVA, and as the first Kissinger Senior Fellow at Yale University. Retired from a 37-year career in the Foreign Service, and later recalled to active service by President Obama to serve as ambassador in Afghanistan in 2011, he has served as ambassador 6 times. Afghanistan, I just mentioned, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Kuwait, and Lebanon. A native of Spokane, Washington, he received a BA in English and holds honorary Doctor of Laws degrees from his alma mater, Whitman College, as well as from the National Defense University, Gonzaga University, Seton Hall University, and the American University of Afghanistan. So for those of you who ever doubted the wisdom of your children's taking a degree in English, give them a counterexample. Anyway, with that, Ryan, we're awaiting your wisdom this morning to kick off our conference. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, Philip, for that. Thank you, Philip, for that generous introduction. You're going to have to wait a little longer for the wisdom. I bring you greetings from Spokane, Washington, the real Washington, in case you're in any doubt. Riffing off of what David Hale said about Iran being a problem for decades, it's actually been a problem for millennia. Iran has always conceived itself as a superpower. About the time I was graduating college in 1971, the Shah of Iran held a 2,500-year anniversary of the Iranian Empire in Persepolis. That would have been the empire of Cyrus the Great. Fast forward a few millennia, and you have the rise of the Safavids. That was the first Shia Islamic dynasty. And one interesting thing about this dynasty, which rivaled the Ottomans to their east, is that its ideological and theological underpinnings actually came from southern Lebanon. The Safavids, which were formed out of a largely Kurdish Sufi order, didn't know a lot about the theology of Shia Islam, but the clerics of Jebel Amal in southern Lebanon did. So in the early 16th century, they went to Iran to impart their wisdom to the new Safavid rulers. And I give you all of this mothy history because we don't do history terribly well as Americans, but other parts of the world do focus on history, and probably none more so than the Iranians. Who they are in their current perceptions has a great deal to do with who they were. And they were always a regional superpower. And that helps, I think, understand a lot of what they're doing today. Again, to bring it into modern times, the Shah of Iran had a message for the region. And that message was that Iran, again, is a regional superpower. It can project, sustain, and win with its forces beyond its borders. And he demonstrated this with the Iranian Navy seizing 3 islands from the newly born United Arab Emirates in 1970, which it still holds. Also in the 1970s, we saw the Shah introduce ground forces into Oman at the request of the Sultan to put down a rebellion in his west, fomented by the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. I'm sure the Shah was glad to help and the Sultan was grateful, but the message was not just for Oman or its rival South Yemenis. It was for the region that, again, Iran can project force beyond its borders, sustain it, and win. And again, a little sidebar here that's worthy of note in light of the current received wisdom that the Sunnis and the Shia of Islam have always fought each other and always will. It's as old as Islam itself. Well, the Iranian deployment was not opposed by Saudi Arabia. In fact, it was facilitated by Saudi Arabia. And indeed, Iran and Saudi Arabia stood as the twin pillars of Gulf security, the fulfillment of the Nixon Doctrine. And you may recall that sobered by the Vietnam experience and not wanting to involve the United States in a ground war in Asia anytime soon, Richard Nixon came up with a doctrine whereby that instead of securing peace for the world with US forces, we would use our allies. That only reached fruition in one area, that was the Persian Gulf. And the twin pillars of Gulf security through the 1970s were Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now we come to the revolution. And it was a true revolution. It overthrew everything, except it didn't. The Ayatollahs were, I think, in the classic mode of Imperial Iran. They too would project forces beyond their border, they would sustain it, and they would seek victory. Now, the Ayatollahs did it with proxies, or affiliates, a better word, because they do not really fully control any of their affiliates, rather than conventional forces. But the strategic logic and the political culture that lay behind this logic was exactly the same as it was for the Shah, and indeed for the Safavids, and one could argue even for Cyrus the Great. That Iran was a power in the region, and it would let the region know it. So as Philip just ran down the roster, we have the Houthis in Yemen, we have the we have Hezbollah in Lebanon, we have the various Iranian-influenced militias in Iraq, and of course we have Hamas now in Gaza. Again, as I noted, these are affiliates. They are not proxies. A proxy force would be, say, the Badr brigades that were formed by Iran of Iraqi refugees at in the early stages of the Iran-Iraq War, or the South Lebanon Army that Israel created and used as a proxy in South Lebanon. The difference is that a proxy force is totally under the command and control of the sponsoring force. And it's hard to make the case that That is true for any of the affiliated groups that Iran is is backing now. They are instruments of power. They are not, in most cases, ideological affiliates. Take the case of Iran and Syria. That was an alliance that was formed at the very beginning of the Islamic Republic in the late 70s and early 80s. The Syrian regime of Hafez, now, excuse me, now also Bashar, is Alawi. Alawi is a schism of Shia Islam that most traditional 12er, if you will, Orthodox Shia would consider heterodox, if not outright apostate. Didn't matter to the Ayatollahs. They saw that Syria would be an important ally in its war against Iraq and for its power projection into Lebanon. We were the recipients of that power projection. I was a survivor, am a survivor of the 1983 bombing of the American embassy in Beirut, brought to us by Iran and Syria. That makes me a little less than sympathetic to the Iranian claims of a violation of diplomatic protocols, the Vienna Convention, and everything else, and the recent Israeli strike on their consular section in Damascus, by the way. So one looks again around the horn here at the Houthis. Well, they are not exactly ideological partners with, or theological partners with Iran either. They are of the Zaydi sect. They do not follow the belief of the mainstream Shia that rule in Iran of 12 imams, also heterodox. And of course, Hamas is completely beyond the pale. They are not any faction of Shia Islam at all. They are, of course, a Sunni, a militant wing of the Sunni sect. So what we're seeing here is relationships based on power projection in the case of Iran, and a sense of advantage to be gained by the forces that they're supporting around the region. Now, what does this tell us about the current and, more importantly, about the future? I have no idea. And that is what these distinguished panels that Philip and Tim and their team have assembled are here to do. Tell you what it means today and what it will mean for tomorrow. I would, my idea of an extreme long-range projection was a week from Wednesday when I was in the service, and that hasn't changed. But I would leave you with just one other thought here, and that is Israel and Iran. We've seen, of course, the first direct confrontation between those two Middle Eastern powers with the exchange of rocket attacks. The Israelis much more successful than the Iranians in that. But it recalls to me an earlier time, then again, the 1970s under the Shah, when Israel had a virtual embassy in Tehran, headed by the great late Uri Librani, later National Security Advisor of Israel, someone I got to know a bit in his latter years. And again, I would just leave you with this thought that nothing is forever in the Middle East. That in the 1970s, under the Shah, Israel and Iran were de facto allies, both seeing a region that was largely hostile and very dangerous to them both. So again, we'll see where this pendulum swings next. But in the immediate sense, we've seen the pendulum now in the opposite direction, where Iran's overreach, if you will, call it certainly tactical overreach, if not strategic, has pushed the Israelis and the Arabs much closer together. And one of the striking phenomena of the current conflict is what hasn't happened. The relationships that Israel has forged, particularly the most recent set of diplomatic ties with the countries of the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco, the Abraham Accords under President Trump, have stayed solid. And we also see the prospect of a Saudi-Israeli agreement that could lead to a formal peace as well in the height of the Gaza conflict. And the Iranians themselves have to be given a little bit of credit for this. Their tactical overreach in pushing very hard into the region with forces that are inimical to the Arab regimes has made this unprecedented rapprochement possible. So, Philip, with that, I'll hand it back to you and look forward to what the panels can do to sort out all this stuff. But it has a long, long history. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Ryan. So, Ambassador Crocker, would you, at the risk of eating into our next speaker, Trita Parsi, and our next panel's time, would you be able to answer a question or two from the floor?
Sure, happy to do it.
All right. Well, Grace is grabbing a microphone. And are there any questions? Ambassador Gabriel, our former ambassador to Morocco.
Who Ryan knows very well. He's been a role model of mine. Ryan, I found it interesting that you're saying that in one case, Hezbollah has more to say than Iran when it comes to its hostilities with Israel. I think the Americans are saying, or the current American policy people are saying that all roads lead through Tehran, not through Beirut. What's your reaction to that? Because you seem to be saying, no, Hezbollah might have more to say about how our special envoy, Amos Hochstein, should be dealing with the situation.
Well, it is, as you know better than anyone, Lebanon is a very, very complicated place. And I just want to say here how much I admire the work you've done with the American Task Force on Lebanon to make it a major policy player once again. Hezbollah is many things. It is an ally of Iran, yet it is, I think, an indigenous Lebanese force. Been represented in parliament for over 2 decades now. It has been part of successive Lebanese governments, and it is deeply, deeply rooted in Lebanon, in Jebel Amal, that goes back at least to the 9th century or so. It is all of those things at once. What I do think we have here is a case where Hezbollah does not want a full-scale war with Israel, and Israel doesn't want that with Hezbollah. But it's important to remember that World War I was something nobody wanted either. And the focus now is, of course, on Gaza, rightly, and on a direct Iranian-Israeli confrontation. But as you know better than anyone, Ed, the situation in southern Lebanon and northern Israel is frankly, it is not sustainable. Tens of thousands of Israelis have had to evacuate their homes in the north because of ongoing Hezbollah rocket attacks. And that is going to have to get resolved one way or the other. I think that we would have seen a much more forceful Israeli response to these repeated attacks were they not preoccupied with Gaza. But when Gaza comes to some kind of steady state, and it will, then there's going to have to be a change in the north, or we are likely to see a much more forceful Israeli response than we have so far. And I think the likelihood of something like the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war. But ultimately, I think at the end of the day, a very long day, Hezbollah is an indigenous Lebanese entity. It always has been. It always will be. And it may find it useful to ally itself with Iran as a means of gaining strength and legitimacy within Lebanon, which it has. But at the end of the day, it has to live there. And I think at the end of the day, there will be an accommodation between Hezbollah in whatever form it is at that time and Israel.
Ambassador Gilmore and then Ambassador Bernstein.
Ambassador Crocker, I'm Jim Gilmore, the former ambassador at the OSCE in Europe. Thank you very much for this. This is really insightful. My question is really quick. Who does Iran consider its major adversary? Are they trying to drive Israel out of the Middle East because they're a major adversary? Or is the United States the major adversary and they're trying to get rid of Israel because they see Israel as an instrument of the United States? Or maybe there's a third option, which I'm not thinking about.
It's a great question. And I'm pausing just a second and figuring out the best way to approach it. I think that in Iran's strategic logic, it isn't so much a question of adversaries. It's a question of their own power and their ability to project power. And if you're projecting power, you have to have an adversary to project it against. And in the case of Iran, that has been obviously Israel, but it's also been other Arab regimes. And it's been the United States. In fact, one could argue, and here I would defer to our much more knowledgeable panels on this, that the very legitimacy of the Islamic Republic has its roots in its adversarial relationship with the United States. And that goes back, of course, to the opening days of the Islamic Republic, the 1979 seizure of our embassy. So one could say that the United States is its primary adversary right now, not because it's going to drive us from the region, although it came pretty close. When you look at it from Tehran's perspective, they drove us out of Lebanon. I was a witness to that. And they, in their logic, they drove us out of Iraq as well. So I think the United States is, of course, the great Satan. Israel is the lesser Satan. But again, in geostrategic terms, under the previous administration in Iran, of course, the Shah was overtly allied with the United States and covertly allied with Israel. So there is nothing forever in alliances or in adversarial relationships. And I would argue there is nothing forever in the current lineup as well. But whatever the adversary is, there will be an adversary because Iran will, whoever rules in Tehran, will seek to project its power outside its borders.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was a fascinating history lesson. So I have two questions. Under the Shah, it was westernizing, and what happened? What failed? How did that happen? And number two, the nuclear. How do you see that playing out? How do you see the world saying you're never going to have a nuclear weapon?
Great questions. What went wrong under the Shah? Well, books can and have been written about it. Some argue that he went too far, too fast with modernization. That the so-called White Revolution of the 1960s, which brought about a massive land reform and broke up traditional feudal holdings, may have planted the seeds of the eventual revolution, because among the holdings that he broke up were those held by the Shia theocracy. And that was something they never forgave him for, goes one strain of argument. But again, that would be a question more satisfactorily answered, I think, by your coming distinguished panelists. In terms of Iran and the bomb, that is an excellent question, because I had a note on it that by the strategic logic I've outlined here, Iran, again, under whoever rules in Tehran, would be likely to seek a nuclear weapon. It's consistent with its vision of itself as a regional superpower. and as a superpower in a region where there are already two nuclear armed states, Pakistan and Israel. Now, for about the last 20 years or so, the pundits have noted that Iran is 6 months or 3 months or 9 months or one turn of the wrench away from a nuclear weapons capability. So far, that has not been brought to fruition, but I increasingly am convinced that that is because of an Iranian choice, not because of Western sanctions or any other forms of pressure. And in a sense, the periodic elimination of an Iranian nuclear physicist is testimony to that fact. They have the know-how, they have the smarts, they know how to do this. They have not yet done it. And that may be enough. Maybe simply signaling to the world that they have the capability, should they choose to use it. That will be enough for now. But again, I think the quest for a nuclear weapon is something that will still be part of the landscape even after the Ayatollahs pass from the scene.
Can we and should we allow it?
Well, that's a great question. If you decide you're not going to allow it, what are you going to do to stop it? And again, this I would echo again, David Hale, there are no good options here. It is, after all, the Middle East. That you can't kill them all. And when the knowledge is embedded in a given community, as it is in Iran, it's going to be very hard to stop. And also bear in mind that the Iranians have had, over 4 decades now to contemplate the fate of the Iraqi nuclear program. When the Israelis took out the nascent Iraqi nuclear capabilities in, 1981. So whatever they've got is probably going to be impossible to eradicate by airstrikes. And if you think that Iraq and Afghanistan were significant challenges, if you're considering a ground movement into Iran to eliminate their nuclear capability, that will be Iraq in comparison will just be a trip to the sandbox compared to what would await an invading force in Iran. So again, there are no easy answers here.
Ryan, thank you very much for a brilliant presentation and very responsive answers to some tough questions. We really appreciate you being with us this morning.